What up, everybody? Happy Sunday, one and all. A brand new International Comic Crusaders. I'm your boy, Al Mega, with the usual suspects, Dave Elliott, Chris Buse. Hopefully, Dr. G's on the way, and our fellow Crusader that last time, the one and only.
You know what happened? The Invisible Woman got pregnant, and she got replaced by Crystal. That's why we have Jeff here. Very attractive-looking man here, standing in for Dr. G.
I'll take it. That's very out of left.
Big horror fan. Big horror fan. Yeah. I'm on my left field day today.
Yeah, you.
But we are back to talk more horror, and that's why Jeff is here. Check out Jeff's wonderful hat here. Let Jeff tell you what it is.
This is a Leatherface hat, Nightmare on Elm Street. You can see it's a cool hat. It's even got stitching on it. You can maybe sort of make out the chainsaw there. And
wow,
cool. I don't remember if I wore this one last time, but I also have a pretty sweet Nightmare on Elm Street Pete Kruger hat. I kind of dig my thematic hats.
Yeah.
I've never in my life seen that.
Oh, that one looks great. That one looks great.
Yeah, the Leatherface hat is.
I've actually only seen. I think I've actually only
and everything. It's really sweet.
All right, guys.
Ooh, going for it, Dave.
Yeah. So check this out, folks.
Let's get serious. Let's get serious.
Let's do it, folks. Because last episode we were talking pre-code horror, history of horror comics, right? And we obviously, our gentlemen here, Chris and Dave, Raymond Bracey is going to lead us into this moment where it ended. There was no more pre-code. A code was born, if you will, and a lot of the things we love started changing, if you will. And was it for the better? What is it for the worse? What the hell happened? Let's do it.
There are a lot of misconceptions. There are a lot of misconceptions about the comic code and how it all came about. Let's just go a little bit back in time. Last time we talked about the big horror boom in the early 50s, 52 being the pivotal year. No more comics were sold in 1 year than in 1952. Nobody has ever beat that, not even in the investor crazy 90s. So 52 is the year when the horror boom really kicks into full gear. Horror is the big genre now. And as it always goes, EC started the horror trend in full earnest. We talked about this. If you haven't watched our previous discussion, check it out. It's on the Comic Crusaders channel. We talked about the dawning of the horror comics, and it became the hot trend around 51, 52. Girls and boys were reading horror comics. And as it always is, when the imitators come, EC was leading the pack, but when the imitators come, they steal the wrong things. They were not looking at the great artists EC had. They were not looking at the great stories Feldstein and a few others were writing. They were looking at the violence, the gore. They didn't pick up on the humor. They made the gore even more graphic. And so EC had to follow suit. They say, okay, well, they're trying to beat us. They even had editorials. If you go back to the original comic books from the 50s from EC Comics, said, oh, disregard our competitors because they don't have our style, they don't have our brand, they don't have the Crypt Keeper. Save your money, look for the original EC product. But they were, of course, affected. They had to make their books more violent. But at the same time, EC, ironically, keep that in mind, got together a bunch of publishers and they said, well, basically, how about we sort of write a guideline what we can put into these books? I mean, our books are read by 10-year-olds. Should we really be this graphic? Should we really have this violence in there? And a bunch of the other publishers said, no, we don't want to do this. This is shitty. Why should we self-police ourselves? Let the market bear it out. And what happened at the same time was that people started to write articles in magazines because, of course, comic books were selling. So you had a platform there to say, well, basically, look at these comic books your kids are reading. And we talked about Dr. Wortham, who was not really the first, but there were other so-called cultural critics who said, well, violence in children is to blame on comic books. And basically, that was what they did. They said, do you read comic books? Yes. You are a violent child, so comic books made you violent. But every kid was reading comic books. Every child was reading comic books. So basically, when you got 5% who were a little bit more violent, and they were violent kids, and there are reasons for that, you got kids who said, yeah, of course I read comic books. And so basically, the whole idea was a little bit flawed. It's like saying, oh, you listen to rap music, so you must be violent. because we had these two guys who listened to rap music who committed a horrible crime.
I love
so
that.
Basically, they were basically going this direction. Yeah, we had this in the 90s too. It's the same thing. It happens all the time. We had the great Satan panic in the 80s. And everything comes back in circles, and it's always the same. It's not looking inside. It's not looking into the families. Because when you think about what happened after the war, America got completely reshuffled. We had the beginning of a middle class. We had the GI Bill that made it possible for men to go to college. Women were in the workforce. People moved into the suburbs. The car, everything changed all of a sudden. And these kids were left behind, and they turned to comic books, and they acted out, and all of a sudden, comic books are to blame.
Chris, have you ever seen a film
Then
called
the circus came into town, and we all heard it.
Go ahead,
The what again?
Have you ever seen a film called The Music
What did I
Man
see?
by any chance?
I don't think I have. I know the musical based on this guy. No, what is The Music Man?
Well, the Music Man is about this this con artist who's always trying to sell people musical instruments, even though he can't teach people how to play them. And he gets parents involved by he starts singing a song about how, like, there's trouble. There's so much trouble. And that starts with T, and that rhymes with P, and that stands for pool. So he starts blaming pool halls on delinquency in the youth, and that just reminds me of this whole thing. So it's been something in the popular
and basically what we have. Yeah, and at the same time, get this, we are not even. I said the circus came into town, which of course are the Senate hearings. We will talk about that in a second. But what really happened was we had comic book burnings. They started in the late 40s, where parent-teacher associations got together. You can see that. I wrote about this. I wrote a lot of articles about this. Go to Comic Crusaders, Comic Book Confidential. I wrote about this. And there were parent and teacher associations, church groups that got together and said, you must collect the comic books from your kids, and we burn them publicly. And there's the great story of Roy Thomas, who gave up a few of his comic books so he could steal some other comic books from the fire, basically. But then, really, the circus came into town, because we have Senator Estes Kefauver, who was get this, the guy who was responsible for these hearings, Senate hearings. He was one time considered a candidate for presidency. But that it didn't pan out. So he was a little bit bitter, but he still was in the limelight. He was still famous. And he said, well, basically, get a few senators together. We want to listen to these kids. We want to listen to these publishers. We want to listen to movie directors and so on. And of course, at that time, Seduction of the Innocent was published. Because there was money to be made in those hills, because these articles Dr. Wortham wrote, got reprinted in Reader's Digest, and all of a sudden, people were asking him, do you want to be a keynote speaker at our school? La-di-da-da. Of course, he wrote a book. And that happened exactly at the same time when these hearings happened. And there's a misconception. These hearings were not about comic books. They had, I believe they had 20 days scheduled for these hearings. And get this, they were live broadcast on television. Ooh, so you had these hearings going on, and 3 days were scheduled for comic books. And there's this idea that, they subpoenaed the publishers, and nothing like that ever happened. They had Dr. Wortham as their expert to give expert testimony. And he surely did, comparing the comic book industry to Hitler.
What?
It's always popular to compare everything to a Nazi, seemingly, even in the 50s. Yes, he did. And he actually said Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry. And
my God!
German. I mean, come on, guy. Rule it in, Dr. Wortham. But Bill Gaines, the publisher of EC Comics, said, well, basically, that's a great opportunity to talk about our books and how good our books are and how educational our books are. We were called Educational Comics for a reason originally. And he said, can I come on and give testimony? And he sure did. But he was also completely hopped up on drugs because he couldn't sleep. He had taken diet pill, caffeine pills, and all that. Whatever you got, Benzedrine was the hip thing at that time. So he was completely hooked up on medication. And then Estes Kefauver showed him a cover from EC Comics. We looked at this last week. The famous Johnny Craig cover. It's also Johnny Craig RBC here on the screen. of a guy holding an axe in one hand and the decapitated head of a blonde woman in the other hand. And basically, he asked him, "Do you think this cover is in great taste?" And Bill Gates looked at it and said, "Yeah, it's in great taste." And he said, "How can this be in great taste? Oh, you don't see her neck." And the newspapers ran this the next day, and comic books were done. So the publishers scrambled and said, well, before the government comes in, we get a lot of pressure now. This idiot here had to run his mouth. What can we do? And they created their own list of things you can do and not do. They hired a former judge to be their top panelist, and they created the comic book code. They hired the guy who ran the comic book code. The publisher got together. And EC was so successful, they said, well, basically, let's kick everything out that makes EC successful and we kill our biggest competitor. And so they ruled everything out that had anything to do with EC Comics. Mm-hmm. And EC Comics was basically left with Mad Magazine. That was not a big thing yet, but it was getting there. And they said, what can we do? We need to survive. And they started a new line of comic books. And before they had the new trend, now this was the new line. And what we see here is one of those new comic books. And we had MD replace Tales from the Crypt. It's a great cover by Johnny Craig, and the stories are really.
So basically, this is
stories about hospitals.
So this is General Hospital before General Hospital.
Yeah. Yeah, but minus the sex and the relationships and anything. It's just there to entertain you, basically. I mean, they are entertaining comics, but if you were looking for the Crypt Keeper, if you're looking for humor, violence, what have you not, in a jugular vein, nothing of that sort existed here. If you go to the next one, you can still see how great Johnny Craig is as an artist.
That's what I do want to focus on that, because even though this is cheesy, MD, whatever, I mean that is a gorgeous piece of art here. This looks fantastic.
Yeah, it's really, it's fine.
Yeah, and if you go, I posted this on. If you go back for a second, if I posted this on my Twitter, because this is exactly what Dan Atkins did later in Doctor Strange. If you go to Doctor Strange, when is it, the first solo issue 169? He completely swiped this when he retells the origin of Doctor Strange. You can see why, because that's Doctor Strange.
But you can see how this killed things, though, because
but if you go to the next,
this isn't going to appeal to children. I mean, because children want the fantastical. I mean, I know comics had adult readers because you had your romance, you had your war, you had your westerns, but like this must have killed the market. Like when you had all those children reading comics, and all of a sudden what they is just gone.
Dr. G Comics. Hey, did you read the latest issue? What Dr. G? What he did? No. I'm just joking.
But look at this. Look at this. What we see here is the comic codes. What you see here now, it's a little bit obscured by our logo, but you see the comics code label.
I'm gonna take it
and right it was completely illegal. It was completely illegal to put out a comic book without a comic book code. But distributors were pressured not to touch any books. Retailers were pressured not to sell any books that didn't have the seal of approval on it. It came from the comic book industry, it came from parents, it came from the government, whoever, but they put pressure on these people. I mean, we had this in the 80s with the Porn Commission. People who are around at that time know that, because retailers were pressured not to carry Playboy and magazines like that, because there was the Mies Commission, who pressured retailers not to sell any material that was considered adult anymore. This is the same thing happening here in the 50s. You can't sell a book without, you can sell it, but you shouldn't sell a book without this seal of approval. Okay. And publishers volunteered to submit all their artwork, all their stories to this commission.
So you can't sell any comics and you can't sell any adult material. So basically you're left with golf magazines and motorbikes and trucking magazines.
But motorbikes not bad, but the other shit.
Yeah, and let's not forget, Reader's Digest was really, really great at that time, because they offered curated content from all kinds of newspapers and magazines, so people had something to talk about at parties and could come across as really smart. And if you go through this, there was an alternative. You would get,
If I can ask, I don't think films were being rated.
I mean, it's great Jack Kamen art, but yeah.
I don't think films were being rated.
Oh yes, they were. Not rated, but they were not. No, they were not raided, but what they had was the Hays Code. The Hays Code was a similar thing. It came into effect in 34, 35, where they appointed a former postmaster general to oversee the films. They had a similar system where they had to submit to this the Hays Commission every movie that was made in the United States, and every movie up to the late 60s was approved by the Hays Commission.
Okay, because I was trying.
And then we had Easy Rider and the kids that broke away from that.
I seem to recall my parents being able to go see films like I Was a Teenage Werewolf as young kids, and nobody was stopping them from going in, and that was, visually.
That was absolutely okay.
Yeah, that was okay. But
that was absolutely okay. But if you go back to no, there was a similar thing that what we had in the comic books was the violence aspect. Okay. What we had with the Hays Code was the sexual aspect, because the Catholic Legion of Decency pressured the studios not to be so sexual.
Wait a minute.
And if you go back
precisely
to King
my
Kong,
point.
I mean,
precisely my point is that the youth could still enjoy violent material, but they can see it on the screen where you can
movies,
say, actually, that's a lot more impactful because you're watching actual people, in the moving images. You're watching. I Was a Teenage Werewolf. I Was a Teenage Frankenstein. But like a two-dimensional image is too much for a child to handle.
Absolutely.
But don't forget also the comics. The comics were actually more graphic than the movies.
That's true. That's true.
Exactly.
But
on the other hand, it's also economics that controls this. This controls this, because if you look at this comic book costs 10 cents. Do you know what a movie ticket cost in 1955? I know, because I wrote a book set in the 50s just now.
I believe my mom.
It cost 55 cents to see a movie. So it's.
Well, I guess we lived in a cheaper area, because my mom said she could go to the movies on a quarter, and it's like see a movie, get a popcorn and a drink.
Oh, you could.
Yeah.
I mean, don't forget.
Yeah, it always depends. I mean, it depends. It's second run movie theaters.
Yeah, exactly. You had the old movie theaters that had second run movies where they had a double bill. You could go in and see two films for less than the price of one.
Absolutely.
Because that was when they weren't actually producing as many.
So
films.
basically,
fill up those. You needed to fill the theaters up.
Right.
Exactly. And I mean, if you look at I Was a Teenage Werewolf, that's quite a harmless movie. I mean, the point I wanted to make was with King Kong, for example. King Kong comes from the pre-code area, the pre-Hays Code era, and certain scenes had to be cut for certain markets. I mean, that sounds familiar. I lived in when I lived in Kansas. Here comes the interesting thing. Because Faye Ray's dress was a little bit too see-through.
Oh,
there was that.
No, there was the scene. There's the scene. I know there was the bridge scene where they kicked the people from the tree, and they were insects, but that was never filmed. But they really filmed scenes from. No,
Kong picks up a native and literally crushes him in his jaws, and that got excised from the film because it was deemed too graphic at the time.
Oh yeah, true. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. There was a lot of stuff that got cut out of the movie, depending on the market. But if you think about it, when I lived in Kansas, I didn't see the first couple of episodes of NYPD Blue because at one point David Caruso moonshines the audience, and in my affiliate wouldn't carry that in Kansas. I mean, it's always the same thing. It's so strange. And explain to a German person how American television worked before there was cable, or really before there was streaming. It's so complicated. Okay, but we're talking comics today.
Yeah.
So if you go to the next one, there was another. They had a whole line of this stuff.
Psychoanalyst, those serious, bro?
I just can't see this selling.
Right? Let me pick this up. I want to know what the doc is going to.
No, they didn't sell. No, they didn't. They didn't sell. You just saw that there was a reprint and said all 4 issues. They all ran for 4 or 5 issues. I mean, this is kind of cool because this is knights and this is medieval battle. That was kind of cool. I mean, I can see kids reading that one. And there was another one with pirate comics. I mean, that could get. And then. Exactly, but then they did something else at the same time, and this is Exactly, because it doesn't have a code. And why doesn't it have a code? And why is it 25 cents? Because EC began to experiment with what they call pictofiction. And you will see in a minute why that was called pictofiction, because they were experimenting with the magazine. Met was not a magazine yet, but they were beginning to experiment with the magazine, but they didn't do a full comic book magazine. What they did, if you go to the next page, is they interspersed text with images. And if this is not the most amazingly drawn story you will ever see, this is Reed Crandall here. And what they did is they did an amazing experiment. And I don't know if I've ever seen this. They took some of their old stories, they used the copy Feldstein wrote on the boards, but they had different artists in their team redraw them. So they completely, this is a story that was originally drawn by somebody else, and they gave it to Reed Crandall and say, look at this comic book, this is the text, redraw the complete story in your style. And they did this with every story. It's quite interesting. I don't know why they did this, but it's quite amazing. And if you look at this art, I've picked a few more pages because I couldn't help myself. Reed Crandall is such a genius artist. I mean, it's so good.
I'll tell you, it looks like he literally just got a bunch of people. He kind of did the Alex Ross thing where he staged a bunch of models and drew from life, because it's just that good.
That second panel right there. Look at the lady. Just that.
I mean, that's it.
Yeah. Gorgeous.
No,
I mean, there's this amazing quote from Jim Steranko.
As an artist,
there's this amazing quote from Jim.
Focus on some single illustrations rather than having to sort of tell the entire story. You know, you could have you can put a lot more detail in it, a lot more texture into it. These look great. I wonder if they would have shortchanged the artist. I wonder if they were shortchanging the artist, because it's like, well, this is only 4 panels on a page. We only need 4 panels from you. So we're only going to give you half a page rate.
But he's putting so much more into it. Like, look at all the tone work.
Artists always will.
But the interesting thing is but there's the interesting thing, and because we already discussed the depths of the talent pool at EC Comics at that time. And that was for a reason, because EC was the smallest publisher. They needed to compete, and Bill Gaines paid his artists better than everybody else. So it goes to reason that he probably paid Reed Crandall quite nicely for this. But look at this artwork. I mean, it's so good. And Steranko, that was the point I wanted to make. Steranko said, looking back to the 1940s, Jim Steranko said that there were 2 artists that stuck out to him, Kirby and Crandall. And
I love this. I love this page.
It's such a forgotten genius
artist. So pulp and noir.
And when you think about it, if you look at Jim Steranko's own graphic novel, Chandler, which is supposed to come at some point called Red Tide, it's very similar format. It's the illustrations with the text, no word balloons.
Nice.
I mean, this is so good. This is Joe Orlando doing another one. I mean, it's just this opening. It's so brilliant. I mean, it's this clearly, it's a bit reflective of Citizen Kane, but it looks very good. I mean, Joe Orlando was also a fantastic artist. I mean,
well, it also looks very similar to the men's magazines that were around that had that same sort of layout and design. You know?
I thought that was Howard Stark for a second. I was like, holy shit. Bro, great looking page too. Damn, bro.
This is still Joe Orlando here. This is still Joe Orlando here. But they sold two issues of each. They tried a horror one, they tried a crime one. They sold 2 issues of each. EC was basically dead in 1956, except Gaines had fired Harvey Kurtzman from Mad, because Harvey Kurtzman said, I created Mad, I want half of it. And Gaines said, there's no way, I fire you, you're gone. And he hired Al Feldstein. And Al Feldstein took the magazine really to new levels. And to make the revenge really sweet for Bill Gaines, Mad in the 1970s sold 3 million copies a month. They outsold everything else. Mad was hugely popular. So EC Comics was doing fine. EC Comics was doing fine. And when he sold Mad, he had sold it, but he still retained his stake. But when he sold it eventually to Warner Communications, he gained a seat on the board of Warner Communications. Just, I mean, you can't make this shit up. The guy, outcast from the comic book industry, for standing up to the senators and willing to testify and then running his mouth, he eventually ended up on the board of Warner Communications. He made Al Feldstein editor for life. That was part of the contract. He said, "You can have Matt, I sell it to you, but Al Feldstein is on as editor for life."
And also,
now there is this idea.
Chris, just 1 second. So yeah, but that all Bill Gaines also had full control and say over everything to do with Mad Magazine until he died. And
which is so interesting because
foreign rights, everything. He controlled it all.
Wow. Absolutely.
And as soon as he died,
and what is even more interesting
is DC fucked the whole thing up.
Yeah. No, they made Joe Orlando president for a while. But the interesting thing is also he no longer owned Mad. That is the funny thing, because basically he had already sold Mad Magazine before as for tax reasons. But he owned the title as publisher and he owned the trademark still. And so that's what he sold to DC eventually. But Dave is completely right. It was in his contract that you don't mess with Bill Gaines. And even Steve Ross, the CEO of Warner at that time, he didn't mess with Bill Gaines. He said, no, Bill Gaines, hands off Mad Magazine, let them do their thing. And it was known. It's amazing. It's an amazing thing. But the idea of having a comic book magazine that is not regulated by the code because it's on the magazine shelf and not on the spinner rack, that was picked up in 1959 by a writer who came in late to the DC fold, Carl Wessler. I talked about Carl Wessler last week when I talked about this amazing story with Sweet Crandall. Carl Wessler is a fantastic writer, one of the best writers who ever worked for DC Comics. And he got an artist, George Tuska, and they basically put out this magazine. George Tuska did not only drew this amazing, or painted this amazing cover, George Tuska drew every story in this magazine. They wanted to get this to the market, but unfortunately didn't sell at that time. 1959, people said, oh yeah, it's a horror magazine, it's still comic books, it's still horror comics, we're not interested in this. So it was only one issue.
Oh.
Cut 10 years later, and then we have, it's 5 years later, 1964, we have Jim Warren coming in and say, oh, I have this great idea, let's do horror magazines and put them on the shelves. Yeah, Jim, but Carl Wessler was there first, but nobody was listening to him. But when Jim Warren did it in 64, all of a sudden, Creepy was born. And Creepy was so interesting, if you go to the next slide, because we see right away why that is interesting.
Yeah, sometimes it's just all about the timing.
Yeah, but if you look at the cover, I think you asked me about this cover. Can you go to the next slide?
No, but just on the cover real quick. I mean, Homie should have never taken off that mask, bro. I think the mask was better.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the
okay. I just wanted to give. I don't know. Okay, but just talk a little bit briefly because I had my slides not correctly in my head. But let's make a little detour to DC Comics first before we go to Warren.
Okay.
Do you know who drew this? This is Carmen Infantino.
Okay.
And they were trying to do horror in DC Comics. This is still before the code. DC Comics was also getting in on the horror trend. So we moved a little bit back. We're still before the code. I just want to include this to see how DC also wanted to get in on the horror trend when it was still viable to do that. And this is a great cover by Carmen Infantino. Just amazing. This cover is so good.
It is. It's amazing. Look at that.
And then you see the code. We're jumping. This is now Neil Adams reviving the character. And this is under the code. We're getting a little bit sexy because we're coming into the end of the 60s. And just a word about the comic code, because we're talking mainly about horror magazines that didn't fall under the code today. But the comic code got loosened up in 71 because there was a movement within the comic movement to say, look here, it's a new thing. We have Easy Rider in the movie theaters. A little bit what Jeff said. Everything is getting a little bit more violent at the movies. Kids can handle it. What about the comics code? And in 71, the code was revised. So a lot of the stuff we saw in the 80s was the Punisher and so on. It was still comic book code, but it got severely toned down from the early 50s because there was a panic reaction. Now they're starting to let things be a little bit more sexy. That would not have been possible in the 50s here. Neil Adams can do a little bit sexy. We can have a little bit more violence. It's all possible. We're going there. And so all of a sudden, DC says, well, basically, we can do more horror again. It's possible. And they revived the Phantom Stranger. And by the way, if you know the original animated Justice, what was it called? Before it was Unlimited, was it just called Justice League? The Bruce Timm show.
Yes, this is
the witch the witch you saw on that show, Tala, who was always hanging out with Lex Luthor. That's her. She originated with Phantom Stranger.
Oh,
You never saw her anywhere else in DC Comics, but she originated with Phantom Stranger. That's that character. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Look at that. I really love that purple shading, that ghost.
Isn't it amazing? Isn't that amazing?
So well done. I mean, and you think about this before computers, folks. I mean, look how great this shit looks.
I do recall before the code got lifted, Marvel was trying to do sneaky things, like they would have like the living mummy, or the Morbius, the pseudo vampire, because you couldn't use vampires, which isn't a real thing, so you had to
it was all possible
workarounds.
Yeah.
Look at this.
Exactly. The idea to have a guy who was really a good vampire. Okay, this is another magazine that they tried to pull, and they were starting. DC was in the end of '60s. They said, let's try to see if horror is still viable. And the interesting thing that happened was Joe Orlando. We heard about Joe Orlando before from the DC Comics. He was hired as an editor to revive the horror line. And the interesting thing is, I saw a house ad in the early '70s for Swamp Thing #1. Swamp Thing famously debuted in House of Secrets. But they were putting out the Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson one. And the interesting thing is, in this house ad, it didn't say, from Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson. It said, from the editor of House of Mystery, Joe Orlando. Joe Orlando was known to kids. They knew Joe Orlando meant horror at DC Comics. So they really pushed Joe Orlando as the editor of that book in the house ad. It's so interesting, isn't it?
Well, the anthology, the horror
So we have Neil Adams doing it again.
The horror anthologies were big sellers, and they outsold a lot of the superhero books.
Yeah, and look, this is an amazing Neil Adams cover. And if you go to the next cover, I mean, this is one of Neil Adams' best covers, I think. If you go to this, is so cool.
Yes, I see this.
So cool.
Now, this is definitely an homage to that Swamp Thing joint right there. What was that? Shit. When he's in the window, what comic book was that? His first app? Fuck.
Oh, that is House of Mystery. That's a little bit later, actually.
Yeah.
Really?
Chris. And that's by the way, that's and by the way, that's the wife of Walt Simonson on the cover. We saw on the Swamp one. Jeff, yeah.
Chris, let me ask you a question. Like looking at the Witching Hour made me think of something else that we see with like EC and Creepy and Tales from the Crypts and all these. And I'm sure you've probably got the details on this. Where did the horror hosts of comics, horror comics, start out? Where did these narrative characters, where did they begin? How did they fit into all of this?
Well, they basically originated, if I'm not wrong, they originated with EC Comics because the idea was born from Al Feldstein. He had these lunatics, he called them, the Crypt Keeper, the Old Witch, and the Vault Keeper. And then everybody else had to have these hosts. And what you have is the Witching Hour. You see the girls here up top, or the women up top. The idea with the Witching Hour was, and that is actually something Joe Orlando came up with because he came from EC Comics. They said, okay, let's do the following. Let's have 3 witches, 2 are old and ugly, and 1 is beautiful. Isn't that cool? And they ran with that. And the fun thing was that the older witches considered the blonde hot one, the ugly one, which was that's fun. That's the and idea. So they had
the 3 witches. You've got the
and what was so interesting.
The throne.
Yeah.
Well, don't forget, this was very much about
And the interesting thing is they took
having the comic books having hosts, just like TV shows, just like the Twilight Zone.
Yeah, I was just kind of wondering where that idea first, how they first came up with that idea.
I mean, it kind of blends, but it it kind of blends with the idea that similar at the same time. And if you read my book, I in my first horror book, The Neon Graveyard, I used that in the book basically because in 1954, which is later than EC started with The Crypt Keeper and so on, we had, of course, Vampira on television. She was the first television horror host. And then there was a whole slew of other hosts. Because what basically happened was that the TV networks bought old horror movies that weren't very good, that were Z-grade movies. And they used the hosts to say, well, basically, oh, these are cool movies. And people became fan of these hosts. There was Zachary, there was Vampira, but Vampira actually was the first. And so we already had this idea in popular mainstream at that time in the mid-50s. Okay, there needs to be a horror host.
You know, come to think of it, this is actually a pretty
But the cool thing about the Witching Hour,
especially if you're doing an anthology book.
But the idea about the Witching Hour is even...
Well, if you don't have a central character, having these narrators basically gives you a character that you can identify with the book throughout the series.
And it goes even further than that, because Joe Orlando really developed this idea with the horror host even further. There is a structural component and the content component to it, because basically you have these older witches who in the book tell the more gothic horror stories, versus the young witch tells the modern horror stories that have to do with technology. And so already you have a content difference, and you give these stories a little bit different shift. And then there was an ongoing story that kept readers invested in these characters because they were looking for their long-lost cousin Igor, because they wanted to have a family portrait. And the joke was, is Igor ugly as the older sisters, or is he handsome as the young sister? They couldn't figure it out. So you had this ongoing idea going through the Witching Hour, which is kind of brilliant.
That's cool.
But Joe Orlando was ultimately brought on board. We saw this because if you go to the next slide, we see the very famous House of Mystery, which was sort of a tryout book at that time. Because if you go back just one issue, it was Dial H for Hero. Very famous property of DC Comics, but it had nothing to do. House of Mystery had nothing to do with horror at that point. And then Joe Orlando came on board and said, "Well, let's make it a horror book then. It's called House of Mystery. Why not make it a horror book?" It was a mystery book early on, but not a horror book. And this is the first issue he did, which ran reprints from the 50s because they wanted to have some horror content. They were not ready, but this is a great cover. It's still a great cover. And then it went full into horror.
Didn't Marvel do a similar thing?
There was a rivalry going on at DC at this time.
Okay, I was about to say, they did a lot of that history, transitioning from like horror sci-fi.
Yeah, but exactly, Johnny. So to superhero, exactly. And here they were taking a book that was originally mystery, then a superhero book into horror, which is also quite interesting. But we also need to keep in mind, this is around 68, 69. And at that time, Marvel Comics was sold. And that meant that Marvel was getting, two things happened. Marvel renegotiated their distribution deal with DC Comics because they were distributed by DC's Comics sister company, Independent News. Long story. They were limited to a certain number of books. They renegotiated the deal at the end of 68. But then they were also, Martin Goodman did this to increase the value of his company. He sold a Perfect Film. And at that time, they were distributed by Curtis, so they were no longer dependent on DC Comics at all. So they began also to expand their portfolio with more titles. And they revived Strange Tales. Strange Tales suddenly was Adam Warlock. They were trying to build their brand. This is another great cover here.
That's some freaky shit right there, bro.
This is so good. I mean, this is
I do love like Neil Adams did when Batman crossed over with House of Mystery and Brave and Bold. There was a really nice. Neil Adams did a homage to the first issues covered by Joe Orlando, 174. So, but it's Batman at the door as the hands coming out.
Love it. Great callback.
Oh damn! I think they're caught. They're giving away where the lady is. Bastards. Look at that. That's another great cover, though, bro. Another great cover.
Yeah, Neil Adams was the man here already.
Oh, yes. Look at this.
Shared this on Twitter yesterday.
I had the great pleasure of seeing Neil a couple of years ago before the COVID shut everything down and getting him to sign my copy of Superman versus Ali.
Did he not give you any of his insightful rhetoric that he likes to give? You know, he always likes to diss somebody. Remember when I met him? When I met him, it was for Jack Kirby's 100th birthday, and my boy Mike, 13th Crusader, pulls out the recorder, hits record. Hey, you know, what do you think about Jack Kirby? You know, being his on his birthday. His art fucking sucked. We clicked off the recorder. We're like, all right, thank you, Neil Adams, for your time. Goodbye.
I didn't get anything like that, but Neil did have he did have a cool little story for everybody who came up to get something signed. Whatever you had to get signed, he had a cool little anecdote for whatever you're getting signed. So that was really cool. You got a lot of information just standing in line waiting turn before you got your interview.
But if you want to listen to another story about creators, I already told you that House of Mystery was revived by Joe Orlando, who was famously hired to come to DC, and at the same time, Dick Giordano was snatched away from Sharp Comics, and he was given House of Secrets, and he's the editor of Dick Giordano is the editor on House of Secrets for the first couple of issues when they revived it. And then Joe Orlando got promoted, and he said, "Oh, why didn't you promote me?" And I said, "Because Joe Orlando is the better editor." And he left DC Comics. He exclusively worked with Neil Adams at the Continuity Studios. So you see his inks, because that was a Neil Adams production with Dick Giordano in Peck. But he had left DC Comics for a while officially. He came back later when Janet Kane became the publisher. But for a while he was out of DC because he was pissed because he didn't get promoted.
Promotions and Oh, there goes that. Okay, I had this, Chris. I fucking had this, and I had to fucking sell it a couple of years ago. I had
this too. I bought it in the 80s. I bought it. I had the.
I'm so mad that you brought this shit up. They just give me flashbacks, bro. Fuck. That's just
Yeah, you see.
It's bittersweet sometimes.
Okay, you see the other great horror artist that you see at that time. Yeah.
That's the whole reason I bought it. It was
Bernie Wrightson. I mean, it's just.
That's the only reason I wanted it, because it was Bernie Wrightson, and I had the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Absolutely legendary. And then we would see his masterpiece with his work on Frankenstein.
Absolutely.
Yeah, bro. Again, I don't know. Was he really appreciated in the culture? I don't know, man. It's like George Perez.
Yes.
I don't see him being appreciated in the culture. George Perez is dying right now, and we're not giving him no love anyway.
Oh, come on. No. I got to disagree. Like,
nah, I'm not seeing it.
My Twitter feed.
Yeah, fans may be doing that, but I'm saying, like, I want to do a George Perez special, and I want to have people that know George. I want to let, as a Puerto Rican, I'm saying, because in Puerto Rico, comic book art is not considered art. So here we have one of the greatest artists of our generation, right? I think. And, you know, unfortunately, on the island, that's not taken serious. To them, the artist is Lin-Manuel, you know, fucking you doing that type of bullshit, you know, or that you are a regular artist. But an artist like George Perez, because he does comics in our culture, you know, outside of people like me that are born outside of the out of the you know, country, don't see that as we are, and it's a shame. So I want to see Puerto Rican step up, fans step up, for more colors, from all over the world, and show this man love before we lose him. Because I don't know if you've seen his pictures, but he's getting slimmer and slimmer every day, you know, and it breaks my heart. I'm happy that DC Marvel did that shit through, what was it, the Hero something, and they re-released. So they did something to bring a smile to his face. But first, we need to do more. Let's give him his flowers while we still have them, because we didn't get to do that for Bernie and a whole bunch of other people. So let's do it while we can.
Yeah, I think, you know, and unfortunately, there's very, very few people who get any sort of the accolade that they deserve outside of the field.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty much like, yes, everyone, the world knows who Stan Lee is.
Yeah.
But then it kind of stops there. It really does. You don't even get people, like, people can't even tell you who created Superman.
Sadly.
Yeah, no, I mean, and there was a time, I think, where probably people would probably be able to sort of, there's probably a good amount of people who could tell you who created Batman, but I would say not now.
Oh no, it's too confusing. You know, everybody now is like, okay, was it Homie? Was it the Finger Man? I mean,
no. I mean, just generally, like when you take a step outside of comics,
Oh yeah, I
and
understand
the general audience,
oh yeah,
they don't get. It's like it's Batman.
that's
It's
my
Superman.
family. That's my family in a
It doesn't-
nutshell.
they
It's
don't
Batman.
care.
If I would say who created him, what the fuck
I mean,
do
it
I
is
know?
at least for fandoms, it's been more viable today because I remember going to cons and outside of reading something like a Comic Scene or Starlog where you would get the odd interview, you
You
didn't
said
know
Comic
anything
Scene.
about the creators, and then when you get to meet them in person, it was kind of surprising because they had no concept of like what they were going to be like, what they look like, nothing like that. And so it's like so I would pass somebody whose work I was a fan of and not know it until I went to their table. It's like, oh, I just passed you a minute ago, but I didn't know anything about you.
Yeah.
Oh shit, folks, we have a special person coming onto the scene. The one, the only, Dr. GB.
Oh, what's going on?
Talking about me?
Hello, Greg.
Yeah, actually, when the comic book MD showed up, I thought about you. Like, is this stories about Dr. Greg G in the comic lab or something was going on?
Hey guys, I have to apologize to you. I photographed a bunch of stuff yesterday and tried to send it through email so I could zip it and send it to you. It's still up there waiting for it to come down. So I do have stuff, but I'm going to have to show it by hand.
Damn. No worries. We'll make the window.
No worries.
Okay, look. Oh, Wortham. Chris, look at that.
Oh.
Where's that from?
Oh,
That's the book burnings.
amazing. Oh, Dr. Wortham.
Oh, wow.
Yes, that's the book burnings.
What magazine is that from? Uh-oh. Oh.
What's really great about this particular issue and the book burning is awesome, but I'll tell you why I pulled this up for us. Come on. You ready?
Let's do it. Oh.
Huh.
Shit.
There he is.
Dr. Frederick Wortham.
Oh, there's Dr. Wortham.
Yeah.
Later in life, because he was pretty regretful about sabotaging the comic book industry. And when he learned about comic book fandom, he was full.
Yeah, because there's also
Go ahead.
Yeah, there's also this misconception. There's also this misconception about Dr. Wortham being anti-comics. He was not anti-comics. I should have mentioned this. He was anti-violence, and he wanted the comic book industry to thrive. But he wanted it to be a different industry. He wanted it to be educational, telling nice stories for the kids to learn. He had a different understanding of the comic book industry as it was. But he was also a homophobic man, even though he was very progressive, which is so strange.
I'm glad you
very
mentioned
much
that because he was against violence. He was very much against what he thought of as subliminal and suggestive homosexuality.
So what he wanted was comic books to be more like Sesame Street before Sesame Street. Huh? Is that what he wanted?
He wanted them to
sell, but he wanted to.
I imagine he probably would have.
No. There's something in psychology, and I asked psychologists when I actually read Seduction of the Innocents in college, and there is a term that really stuck with me: mental hygiene. And I asked psychologists, I said, "This is a horrible word." They say, "No, we use it all the time." What mental hygiene means is that you think good thoughts, positive thoughts, and that was where he was coming from.
And he thought that the violence was engaging and intriguing to the kids. But what was very much causing him trouble was the underlying sort of ethical structure, which included the quote-unquote Batman and Robin gayness. The Wonder Woman bondage obviously was a factor of that. But then you had this acting out, as he saw it, of the scripts. He thought kids were actually acting out the scripts. And obviously he loaded his research to indicate that, but it was very anecdotal. You remember he was in the Lafarge clinic and he dealt with kids who blamed their behavior on being inspired by the comics.
You're blowing my mind with this cover.
That's the interesting thing. It's that he also. Do you know who did this? Al?
Joe Staten.
Do you know the artist here?
Yeah.
I do not know.
That's Joe Staten.
Oh,
and
he was a really good painter. He did a lot of painting covers for Charlton Comics.
I kind of noticed a mistake. It looks like they copy pasted the lady that's on the hand on the back. Because you notice by her leg is really wide. It's like they forgot to blank out that white.
Well, also, compositionally, it's about as amateur as you could hope for. Guys, I wanted to ask you,
going back to
Chris and Dave, did you guys, in the conversation that's to be had, I did bring some, I didn't bring a lot of EC because I figured you guys had covered it. But did you guys bring any of the undergrounds into this?
No, I haven't seen Undergrounds.
Got you covered.
We get
some cool stuff.
Okay. Excellent. That's excellent. Very good thinking. Very good thinking. I touched on it a little bit in a minute, but not in the way you probably do. But great. We are very complimentary today.
What is this, bro?
But,
what is this?
Talking about one more point.
I've never seen it.
I'll come to this in a second, but I just want to go back to Dr. Wortham. He also attacked Superman for being basically a white supremacist. And isn't it interesting that now 50 years later we have a similar discussion? Isn't that so interesting? Isn't that very interesting? I just want to make that point. This is Charlton here in
supremacist.
Well, along those lines, Brosi, you've got Volodymyr Zelensky, who's actually Jewish, and he needs to be removed for being a Nazi. It's a strange world.
Right? Fuck.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? It's so fascinating, isn't it? It's so amazing.
Yeah, I mean, you can talk about Superman being a white supremacist, but we all know it's actually Batman.
Oh man, you're gonna get us with some hate, man.
Exactly.
Well, I mean, the thing we were talking about this the other night.
Yeah,
of course,
absolutely.
The new Batman movie is out, but the thing is you look at whatever you think of Superman, you're looking at Batman, and here is a Tony Stark figure, a multinational industrialist going out on the streets tonight, beating up the rabble. So I mean,
exactly.
Implications of that are pretty frightening.
I know, right? He goes into the hood to beat up
absolutely true. If you go back to maybe if you go to the original stories, I mean, Superman was a socialist and Batman was a fighter for the status quo, meaning the white rich people should not be.
Yes, and by that law, and Captain Marvel must have been a communist Captain Marvel must have been a communist because of that big red suit.
Can I just say one quick thing?
Definitely. Definitely.
I've got some friends from around the world, from different parts of the world, and it's very interesting, particularly in the older comics, as when you're young and you're a kid and you're looking at the comic book. I've got friends who, from the Hispanic community, who thought that to them, because Batman and Superman both had dark hair, they just presumed that they were them. They didn't think that they were white. They thought of them. They thought it was them. They just thought, okay, yeah.
It's like listening to the Beatles and wondering why they sing with an American accent.
Well, there is a certain amount of perception of that, because I'm also a fan of manga, and you look at manga and it looks very Occidental versus Oriental, if you want to use those phrases. But if you ask the Japanese, they say they all look Japanese to us because this is just our art form.
Yeah. And it's idiomatic. I mean, you have people working in the same character forms. Where did you find this, Chris? This old Charlton Scary Tales?
I love this cover. I am digging the shit out of it, though. And
there's the internet. It provides all kinds of images.
Next time I will go to the
interwebs here. I don't.
No, see, it's try that.
When
I was a kid.
That's a good one.
When I was a kid, I was actually really lucky that it was at a time when not only did we have all the Marvels and DCs coming in, but we were getting all the Charlton comics coming in. The occasional.
I think you're going to find that on the interweb.
Whoa, wait! Put that cover up again. Holy shit, bro!
It's a little bit down.
Another EC comic.
It's a little bit down in the midst of my stack, but I don't think you'll find that on the interwebs. This is an underground comic, obviously an homage to EC. It's from 1974, and what I love about it is when you get into the interior of it. It's one of those rare underground comics that's in color. Richard Corman.
Oh
Richard
man,
Corman.
the creator of Din himself.
Oh, very cool.
In his early days.
Very nice.
So
Cool.
I mean, I don't know what you've got lined
Excellent.
up, but I have a few examples here of stuff that, you know, once the Comics Code, once the direct market came in, and once the Comics Code, you know, the Underground Comics directly addressed the Comics Code by saying we're going to find a different means of distribution, and it opened the floodgates. Really. Oh, I remember this. Wow.
And if you want to talk jumping on the bandwagon, this is Archie Comics.
That's Archie, yeah.
Archie Comics is also now fully on top.
It's the reason I'm glad you mentioned that, Chris, because I was looking at going.
If you go to
there was a title, Archie's Madhouse. Archie Madhouse was actually the title.
It was? Oh, cool.
Which is exactly the same series. And they continue to the numbering. If you go to the next cover, it's actually quite risky.
I absolutely.
So this is Grant Morrow.
I gotta say, I adore that, especially in the previous page, that logo, where you know the logo looks like this haunted manse. I love that. That's
the logos are different in every issue. They're all hand drawn each issue.
Very nice.
I'm crazy. I would suggest that this must be really Jughead's version of Betty. And if you go back to the one before, that's probably Archie's Dream of Veronica.
Ray Morrow was also editing.
That's probably where they got the idea for the television series version.
Ray Morrow was also editing.
But look, if you go to the next page, if you go, let's get who is the artist here? Can you guess the artist?
Yeah, Bruce Jones. Bruce Jones.
Yes, very good. That's
like
Bruce
a
Jones.
Good one.
So Bruce Jones is coming on the scene now as an artist and a writer, and that's a name you will hear quite.
I have a couple examples in here of Mike
premier writers.
Harkening back to the, are we on? Are we on, you guys?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Chris, can you guys? So first of all, I've had horrible COVID. Sad to say.
But I'm glad that you're feeling better. You're here with us, bro.
Moderately. And about the time I came out of it, I have my dear old aging going blind mother is in the hospital. So it's been crazy. I would have done this earlier because I have all these pictures I was going to send you, and I thought maybe a good place to start.
Hey, no, don't worry.
Here's the burning of the comic books. We've got to get rid of this.
Okay, wait. I want to say something here. I want to point this out. Why are there so many women there in this book burning? Was that intentional?
Those were mothers.
So this is mad mothers against drunk driving before. So this is mothers against comics. The Max.
Yes, it's Mac.
Max.
Yeah.
Mothers against white supremacist Superman.
Yeah, Mac. And they are all named Karen for some reason.
Karen Smith, Karen Jones, Karen White, whatever, bro.
There's a whole conversation, Chris. Oh my God.
Okay. No, hang on. Now we're in 1964. I told you about the horror magazine Carl Wessler and George Tuska wanted to start in 59. That didn't pan out. Now here's Jim Warren, who says, well, basically, that's a great idea. Let's put out magazines. We put them on the shelf. They're no longer
completely off of the comic book
on the shelf. Stay away from the kids.
Completely aside from the comic book distribution regimen. Put the ice. When I was a kid, I would go down to a newsstand.
He got a lot of.
When I was a kid, I would go down to a newsstand to get. I was interested in Cerebus. I was interested in Creepy, and this stuff was behind the counter, up with the Penthouse and Playboy.
Oh wow!
So before we go away, I'm just going to show. I'm going to flash.
Jack Davis doing the cover. One of the premier.
This is a horror comic of a different sort. This is an informational comic book about how the atom and atomic energy works. But I think we should have a little slight mention of this because this is not subject to the Comics Code, but it is talking about one of the horrific traumatic fears of the United States. The United States, quote unquote, victorious in World War II, highly, highly traumatized by two things. We were the ones who dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, And while we watched Europe go down in devastation to carpet bombing, it hadn't happened here. And a lot of American psychology since that war has been, we want to make sure that never happens in the United States. And I think that has something to do with what EC brought forward, these underlying fears that couldn't be spoken.
So it became sort of a catharsis.
Exactly, very much to the
Well,
point.
you know, that you could say that the Japanese had Godzilla.
Yeah, there was the idea.
Yeah.
You know what? If they
There
really
was
had
also
Godzilla, they
two
wouldn't
things.
have
There was the
dropped
other thing that.
I'm sorry.
But the more interesting thing you will see also in EC Comics, and that what made EC Comics such a standout, is that Al Feldstein was really a cynic, because what he did, and that was something the kids felt, was that the new suburb, the picket fences, they were falling apart, that there was something wrong with the nuclear family. Al Feldstein really tapped into this understanding that kids said that, oh look, our parents are not happy. Mom is always on drugs, she's in the house the whole time, father has affairs. The idea that in the 1950s the nuclear family was a lie was really very prevalent in EC Comics. That was why they were the most dangerous comic books in the world.
So again,
and here's Jim Warren, he's using all this talent.
All right.
I'm going to interpose a few things to catch up with you chronologically, Chris and Dave. I'm sure you guys have mentioned this. This is a reprint, but this is how EC responded to the Comics Code Authority. It brought out a couple magazines that it thought would be specific.
Move it over to your right. There you go.
He thought would be specific to the adult audience and have a different form of distribution. Tales to Carry an Impact, Psychoanalysis, MD, comics that allowed him to use his kind of O. Henry social commentary, but in an audience that would not.
We talked about that. We talked about that. We already.
Cool.
We already talked about that, but thank you. Impact is quite interesting because the issue you held up is very interesting because it doesn't carry the code. The first issue slipped through, and the reason why there's one story in there called Master Race. Yes, but I know the first issue doesn't have the code, and that's why the issue the story Master Race by Kriegstein was allowed, because it slipped through the code.
If you can show
that's why that story is in there, which ironically is.
Guys, you want to talk horror? I just want to announce this. It just came out.
If you can show this for just a second, we were talking about Bernie Krigstein, and I think this is probably the ultimate. This is the ultimate fear story, because this is the story of the humanity preying on itself. But there's, in terms of, and I'm sorry we don't have the photos, I have to hold this, but I wanted to mention to you, since we talked about Bernie Krigstein, so here you have the very first page of Master Race. And at the very last panel there, you can see him doing these incredible micro breakdowns. And the beauty of the storytelling isn't just that is an incredible notion. If you go through this entire story, it culminates in a replay of that first panel. Did I find it? Wait a minute. Right here. Absolutely. In the second tier. In the second tier of this page.
So it bookends.
Exactly.
Lovely parallel construction, right? Just lovely storytelling.
Yes, I mean, if you want to look, and if you wonder what happened to Kriegstein checked out of comics at that time. But this is we're now on the Warren trend here, and we talked about Kriegstein last week. This is creepy. And this is Warren ruling the board here at the time. And now something interesting happens at the same time, because as we had with EC Comics, imitators were beginning to flood the market, and they were naturally more violent than anything that Warren put out. And if you go to the next slide, you see what I'm talking about.
Al? That looks so great. I love this cover. Hold on, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah.
What you got?
Okay. And do you know what this is? This is Eerie Publishing, not Eerie Comics from Warren. This is Eerie Publishing, and Eerie Publishing was notorious for making horror comics really, really sexist and violent. And we get to see a few more examples of this.
Which I would argue is a response. Which I would argue is a response to some degree. What year are you at here, Chris?
This is dope, man.
What year?
Now.
Because this is the mainstream responding to. This is the mainstream responding to the underground,
to Hammer.
So this is the very first so-called underground.
Yeah, but it's also a Hammer horror here. That's a lot.
And the reason I mention that is because that opened the floodgates to a lot of comic books that were basically kind of obsessed with EC. Al, can you show this to everybody? They're kind of obsessed with the notion of EC because EC opened the door. And this is pretty crude, but the reason I wanted to show it to you, aside from the fact that it has this lovely 2-color printing on the inside.
Oh, dope. Kid Kill. Oh my God.
Is that of course opened the door to.
Oh shit! Two-fisted zombies. I mean, where are they putting this?
This is
true homages.
But this is not underground. This is here. You can buy this, and if you go to the next page, this is a magazine you can buy at a newsstand. And if you make it big, you can see what this is.
Oh, wow.
I chopped off her head. Oh shit!
Do you know the artist?
No code here.
This is interesting because this is exactly.
It looks like Ditko, but is it Eric Stanton?
No, this is Dick Ayers. This is Dick Ayers.
Yeah, that's not Ditko.
No, it's Dick Ayers. And what Eerie was doing, Eerie Publishing was doing, they took these old horror stories from the pre-code days, from the 1950s, that were already pretty violent, and they told their artists, redraw them, make them more sexy and more violent. So this is their answer to what Jim Warren was doing. They took the old stories, they took these stories, and they had the artists redraw the same stories.
This is 1975.
It's actually made it into my new book.
This is people saying the comics code is gone. So what we can do is we can start reprinting. Now this isn't Gladstone. This is a company called East Coast Comic Company. They did a series of 12 issues, and they just took old EC comics. There's no comics code on that. And they just restarted reprinting them for the direct market. Classic issues. And I'm just about to catch up to you. Here's DC. Here's DC, Mike Kaluta, trying to get into the fact that we can start saying things like nightmare, horror, zombies, what have you. So,
bro,
I'm caught up with you, Chris. Thank you for your
because the code got loosened in 71. This is
of course
no problem.
Where
so
that was all
this is still Dick Ayers. It's such a great story.
Whoa!
Beautiful cover.
Yeah, but we are not there yet. We are not discussing. We're not discussing that today.
I discovered.
Okay.
Excellent.
Okay. So this is still Dick Ayers here, ruling the board. Such a great story.
Look at it, 7.
So if you have a chance, check out Eerie Publishing from the late 60s. That's so good. And Dick Ayers actually made the story better. I have the original story. I should have pulled it as well as a comparison. But he's really improving on that story. There's a lot of there's this trope here of the nerdy kid and the attractive girl everybody wants, and it's quite interesting. So the story really is interesting because he kills her as we saw. He kills her as we saw in the first panel. And then he goes home, and his sister is teasing him. So he said, "Why are you late so home?" And he said, "I walked Mary home from school." And she says, "Oh, Mary, she wouldn't look at you twice." And said, "Yeah, that's why I killed her." And he's telling the same story at dinner, and everybody's laughing at him. And then he hangs himself in the barn.
I don't know. I think Wortham would laugh at this because this is kind of what he's talking about. What you have basically is a story of a kid who's trying to score, and so because he doesn't know how to do that and he's afraid of it. He ends up killing her, which is a sexual act turned into violence. It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
And then he's even made impotent again by his family. It's very deep, actually.
So, and may I just say this? I don't know how many people here are Night of the Living Dead fans, but tell me this does not look like Barbara's brother. They're coming to get you, Barbara.
I have a suggestion for anybody who's interested in going back to Night of the Living Dead.
It's been around the same time.
Particularly during the Obama administration, Night of the Living Dead, obviously not intentionally, but if you watch Night of the Living Dead in the context of the Obama administration, because he was so persecuted and so hounded for his race, you look at Night of the Living Dead and you think this is an allegory, really. It works beautifully as an allegory. Here you have the only really effective agent in Night of the Living Dead is this black man who's trying to save everybody. He's got us all in a house. He's trying to keep everyone safe. He has a plan for keeping everyone safe. And yet, he's the one who gets killed at the end. shot by the police.
That fucked me up so much.
And here's the interesting thing, because they asked George Romero about this, and he said, "So you cast a black guy as the lead?" And he said, "No, basically, I cast the best actor in the crew. That he was black, I didn't care about."
Right.
Isn't that crazy?
I love it. By the way, I'm going to throw one more up, and I'm sorry to mess with your narrative. But a part of the EC obsession that ran into the undergrounds, as you can see right here, this is not a horror comic, but this is when the code was released and people decided that they could do whatever they wanted. This is Jack Jackson doing, why can't I do one of those old classic historical EC comic books without any restriction for what I'm capable of portraying? And of course, this is, you can see that even in the first pages, it's evoking that EC style of storytelling.
Gorgeous. Look at that.
So the reason I mentioned that, Chris, and you guys, is because the undergrounds freeing themselves from any constraints of the comics code really opened the doors for places like Warren and Erie to go, all right, we're going to take this mainstream.
Yeah, it's basically what they were doing. They were a precursor to the direct market. Dr. G already said this, because they were selling their comic books in the head shops and in other places where you could buy your, of course, narcotics were illegal, but you could buy a bong and you could buy these comics under the counter. So these comics were really in the college circle, college dropout circle. And at the same time, we have Jim Bourne here distributing this. This is regularly distributed. This is nothing under the table. This is only, as we said, it's next to the Playboys, next to the Penthouse. It's on the magazine shelf.
Newsstand.
And if you were wondering what this is just purely, it's purely here copyright retention. We talked about this with Jeff also. This is an Ashcan issue. This is the very first issue of, this is the cover. It's the very first issue of Erie. And this is an Ashcan issue just to retain, or just to gain the trademark. They put this out in 69 or 68, and this is just a few stories. There's no glossy paper, no nothing. It's just putting it out and selling it 35 cents just to secure the trademark. Still, there was Erie Publishing, but the interesting thing here now about Erie is also still Jim Bourne continued on his quest to bring back the old EC comic book artists. And we talked about Johnny Craig before. Let's go to the next page. And this is really Johnny Craig coming into his own as an artist on horror magazines.
I want to ask though, before I move it. So if I was going to my newsstand, I would find it like this, black and white, first issue for 35 cents.
No, this is the Ashcan. Erie and Creepy had color covers, color magazine.
This would have been probably most likely just to have gone out to wholesalers and retailers as an example. You know, when you go to the distributor and you give them an Ashcan that would go out to retailers and they could get a taste of like, this is what this new magazine is going to be. So it'd have a little snippet of the information, but obviously like today, a lot of these are worth a lot of money because there wasn't that many of them and not many survived.
And it's important to mention that they were showing these to the distributors, not because we were in a direct market. These were all returnable. You put these on the newsstand, hoping that you would sell through, and they were disposable.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's really neat.
They would tear the cover off.
Absolutely.
Send the cover back.
This is.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, exactly. And this is still Johnny Craig here doing his thing. Yeah.
Beautiful. It's lovely to see him working in black and white. That's one of the things I love about the Warren and the Skywald books.
So good. So good. And if you look at this is Stephen King took this from For the Shining, this reveal here. Where he turns his wife around and she's long dead. And this is the reveal. He took this for The Shining. I'm sure.
Oh yeah, that bathroom scene, bro. That was some freaky shit, bro.
I also love how you have Uncle Creepy is kind of Uncle Creepy. Uncle Creepy's not so much the tomb dweller and the crypt keeper. He's like a fan of this stuff. Going, hey, this is enjoyable. Let's do this one.
He's just a nerd. He's just a nerd. I mean, this is kind of cool actually. This is also one of my favorite Johnny Craig stories. I mean, if you really want to deep dive into the EC comic horror stories and into magazines, go on Comic Crusaders, Comic Book Confidential. I wrote 12 columns about EC Comics, 30,000 words each. I wrote 30,000 words each, 5 parts on horror magazines. So if you want to check this out, go Comic Crusaders, Comic Book Confidential, read my columns.
This
Really?
looks like
All
a
there
photo.
for free.
This
for you
looks
to
like
enjoy.
a photo to me. This is gorgeous. Holy shit.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Well, as is
Johnny
common, you know, photo tracing.
Epa. Oh my
There you
God.
go.
My
that a
favorite
fan-
cosplay on earth.
Yep.
You like to dress up this way?
Yeah.
The
Okay.
one to view. The one to view.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
I think that-
And a woman created this outfit actually, because
Really?
a woman created this outfit. Trina Robbins recreated this. Yes.
And of
Alright.
course,
And
the beauty
this
of
is actually not the
this
original
book-
cover. I should have put the original cover because
Yeah, I just want to say this, then Chris, and then
yeah,
Greg.
it's not the original cover because they had a different they had a different cover originally and they pulled it.
So I just want to say, for women, they say, oh, men over-sexualize women. You're telling me that a woman created this whole outfit, the most over-sexualized outfit
yeah.
ever.
which begs the interesting point of the notion of the succubus, because it's like with Red Sonja, clearly with Vampirella. Why in God's name would they walk around like that? It is psychologically disarming. They're not worried about being wounded. They want proximity to the hero. They don't defeat the hero, through weaponry. They defeat the hero through proximity. And this draws the hero. All of us are staring at this picture right into her proximity, which allows her then to use her nefarious arts, which are, of course, we can say seduction, whatever, poisoning, but it's the influence of her persona that draws you in. She's not this. I think it's very clever that Trina did this, because men would be like, hey, look at that. And she'd be like, yeah, go ahead, look at that. It's a Medusa image. It rivets your attention and it holds you.
Exactly. And you see the bat wings in the background, and you see how one of her foot is placed on a skull. She claims the stake. I mean, this is really nailed it. It's really, she is completely in control. She is not sexualized. She is in control.
Exactly right. Exactly.
And I do want to say, I held this motherfucker in my hands at Boston Comic Con. In my hands, I was just a couple of dollars short, and I couldn't buy it.
Oh,
I was like, oh man, I really wanted it, bro. I really want it.
I bet you're a lot more dollars short now.
Oh yeah, kind of a criminal level. This is actually a Kali image. She's got her foot sitting right there on the skull. So you can't, on the one hand, it's evoking the thrill of the death and the little death, but there's no ambiguity in what she's offering there.
Oh, has this cover been ripped off?
No, it's perfect. And I mean, sure, of course. I mean, it's a Pieta, but it's also this is the special issue where Jose Gonzalez comes on the book, and he would be the artist for Vampirella for the next 10 years, who really would make the character. I mean, Archie Goodwin and Jose Gonzalez. I mean, before that it was Tom Sutton, and we had a little bit writing from Forrest Ackerman, who just wanted to have Tom Sutton draw a sexy girl, and Archie Goodwin really shaped the character, and then Jose Gonzalez replaced Tom Sutton because
he was wonderful. Jose Gonzalez. It's funny because you could make this is definitely a Pieta, but you could also say that this maybe influenced Superman holding Supergirl in Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Well, this is such an iconic image.
It is.
It's
definitely
a woman like
it's
this.
The Pieta.
Yeah.
Reverse.
Yeah. It's a Pieta, gender swap. We would say these days.
Oh, this is a great example of what you're talking about, Chris. Spectacular.
Look at all that beautiful detail in there.
Yes.
The layout of the graveyard is spectacular.
Yes. Yes, this is gorgeous. Right. I mean, the blacks, the grays, the whites, the line
and just to talk about a little bit about what developed point Dave brought up, because talking about paying artists, and we talk about artist rights here also, versus Bill Gaines paid his artists better at Marvel, at DC Comics. Jim Bourne was a notorious penny pincher, and he was always late with his payments. So a lot of his earlier artists left him. And what he would do is he would recruit guys from Spain and Italy and so forth for one, he could profit on the strong dollar versus the weaker European currency. On the other hand, they didn't know the American rates, so he could always cheapskate them. So that
we've talked about this before. Warren is looking at his printer bill to keep the magazine going. May I say compositionally, gentlemen, here you have this angel in the extreme foreground, and the angel, as you notice, she's kind of looking down and in, whereas from the grave, you have the image of death, the deviltry, Vampirella, and she's in a similar position, but she's looking up. And I think it's just spectacular subliminal kind of messaging, which is you have this ghostly, solid, static form of an angelic promise, and then you have this active form that's dealing with carnal existence. That's what vampires are really dealing with, the carnal existence, where they've lost their essence and they just have to perpetuate their.
Can you just for us?
Oh my God!
Can we just go back? Exactly. And the other thing you see here, Jose Gonzalez was a romance artist, believe it or not. And you see a lot of the late 60s, early 70s mod fashion on Vampirella. You see that, and you see completely, she's no longer looking American. She looks very exotic. She looks very European, Mediterranean. There's a lot of change going on when Jose Gonzalez comes on.
I'd love to see his photo files, because that model is...
There's a very good book from Dynamite, and it's a collection of Jose Gonzalez artwork that was put together by the artist David Roach.
Gentlemen, do I need to point out to you?
Yeah, there's also an artist edition.
Is it important to point out to you?
I think I know where you're going with this.
Is it important to point out to you?
I mean, it's right.
The greatest underlying fear of all of this, and this goes back to Keats with La Belle Dame sans Merci and etc. The Gotterung of patriarchy being afraid of carnal existence. And here it is. Here she is. She's in the red of the vaginal, and she's extending her hands to the fallopian tubes, gentlemen. The fallopian tubes, gentlemen. I mean, that is an icon of female incarnational Faustian bargain. And he's like, no, I've come through you, and my body is mortal. Life is a sin. And there she is going.
The question ends up being: is he trying to ward it off, or is he fearfully reaching for it? There's that inner conflict in that figure.
You nailed it. That's exactly right. This is the thing that you want to most. And it's the thing that is actually, it's an illusion. The idea that's being presented is that, you have the form of the goddess who comes to you in her most fantastical, gorgeous form. And as soon as she kisses you into that deep sleep, she turns into a vampire or a succubus or a vampire. Satana.
And do I need to tell you this cover makes it into my new book, which is about gods. This cover is in my new book. I'm discussing this story because it's Chris Claremont, one of the very, very early Chris Claremont stories. Excellent. This is, by the way, Neil Adams here.
And it's worth mentioning that it's a very
work on horror magazines.
It's worth mentioning that it's a very Western misapprehension of the goddess form. She's not telling you that you are valueless and she just wants to devour you. She's really telling you the terms of your material existence. You come into this carnal form and you may have this fantasy of the heroic, but the heroic is like everything else. It ultimately succumbs to the terms of existence, which is mortality. So all of these fear comics, particularly Wertham and Easting and Cumming, the fear of mortality.
If I'm not mistaken, these pages are from Dracula.
Which is exactly this.
Yep.
Exactly, by Neil Adams. Just another point I wanted to make, pitching my new book, which is exactly what Dr. G told about, is this idea: once gods walk the earth, we will be much more, we will understand our mortality even more. The gods are there to remind us of our mortality. There's just a line where basically all these bravado male heroes suddenly realize they're completely without merit.
Well, heroes ultimately,
stand when the gods work.
As we find in the Greek myths,
the idea.
The hero ultimately serves a purpose. He's trying to contain the demonic forces as represented by Satana. But the heroes necessarily become monstrous, because ultimately, if they've succeeded, the best we can hope for with these heroes is if they've succeeded in subduing the monstrous elemental forces, they themselves take on that role because it's their existence. This is another reverse Pieta, and the reason I want to call it out is here again, you have the nefarious undead taking the icon of life and regeneration of the female and making off with her.
Well, there's also virginal purity because she's, of course, dressed in white.
But again, exactly. But just going back to Greg here, the idea who is the monster is an idea that the hero puts on the villain. What if the
Bracey,
monster
you talked about that. You talked about that ambivalence.
That's more
here in
interesting.
the far background, you have the white-haired, ideal male who's ineffectual in his address of the purity. He wants to protect it. He wants to guard it. He wants to look at it as something that's, but the vampire, Dracula, of course, in the Bram Stoker novel even, he has no qualms. He's here to prey upon that life-giving force. He's not going to protect it. He's going
to the virile element.
He's the ultimate bad boy. He's the ultimate bad boy.
And of course, if you notice,
and it's the fear of the other, of course.
I'm not claiming entire consciousness here, but the interior lining of his cape is red, and this is the life-giving blood represented by the woman in her purity. It's fantastic.
I also want to point out that's Robert E. Howard here, Solomon Kane, Vampire Slayer.
Yeah, right. I saw that. Cool.
Anything to do with vampires?
Yes.
I would also just point out,
and here we have to.
Go ahead, Dave.
No, I was just going to say
we've got Lilith here.
It's just purely color. It's just you've got a dark background. She's in white. It just plays into it's about what's going to stand out on a cover. So a lot of the artistic choices just happen to play into all the horror themes and memes because of that. So
at the same time, these are universal. These are universal patterns that go back. Again, as I said, we saw those images of Vampirella, and there's a Kali effect there.
Yeah, and we're naturally drawn, it's especially since the comic readership was majority male anyway. You're naturally drawn instinctually, like, oh, this is the innocent. You want to protect, or at the very least, you are concerned for her future. And it's just all this primal stuff that's brought up because the artist, the composition just works that way, and it cues into things that we've got hardwired into ourselves.
Yeah, exactly right. It's an archetypal pattern. The only time men bleed in profusion is on the battlefield facing their mortality. Women bleed consistently, and it's a mystery that scares us, which is a great segue into Lilith.
Isn't it? Anybody knows. Hey, fuck, what's going on here?
Daughter of Dracula.
And
that's a very Steve Gerber title, by the way. This is Steve Gerber. Unfortunately, not one of his better stories. Steve Gerber didn't really know what to do with this character, but it's just wanted to include her because, as we saw with Satana, this was also the time of powerful, strong women. So this is nothing that was created just yesterday.
And
we had these characters in the 70s created by men.
Speaking of archetypal forms, to me, this is redolent. If you guys are familiar with Gustav Dora, one of the great illustrators.
Oh, yes.
This image is redolent. Here you have an intrusive figure. She's a nobody anybody knows. She is above the fray and looking down into what really is representative of the entire culture. You've got shops and stores and studios. This, to me, is redolent of the image of Satan sitting on the promontory above Eden going, I gotta fuck this up. I'm going to go down into that garden and I'm going to create havoc. And here she is going, we're just getting started, boys. I'm going to give you what you think you want,
which is also
purposes.
But the name Nobody is also a play on the Odyssey, because as we know, when Ulysses attacked the Cyclops, he told him his name Nobody, because then when the other monsters wanted to help him, was shouting, "Nobody's attacking me," and nobody came to help him. This is a wonderful play on that too.
I love that you mentioned this is Gerber, and I think what's interesting, even if it's not his best story, you can see it here, that late 70s New York. It's been called a toilet, a cesspool. This is the existential existential issue that we have. We want this purity of society, but our own lusts and our own desires create a system upon which the goddess herself says, you guys are messing this up. You guys
Well,
are
this
not
is a-
seeing the gifts that are available to you. And I'm going to be an avenging angel to bring you back to the original values,
That's a
which
great
aren't
shout.
about exploitation. It's about survival.
Because she's a predatory creature here, and as a vampire is superior, other than having to worry about light. She's looking down on them because in her interpretation, she has every right to do so. They are lesser than her, and she stands high above them.
She would actually probably justify her predation on them by saying that they are ultimately predators. They're eating the planet. They're eating the planet. And she represents that notion, that zombie notion of you're not living in harmony with creation. You're feeding off of creation. And now creation, or a nefarious element of creation, is going to feed on you. It's the idea of mortality turned into a nefarious
and all of
curse upon humanity.
Yes, let me just address this and why this.
Did you notice that in the lower corner? I'm sorry, Chris. Did you notice in the lower corner for the squalor of a breeding ground? So again, the sexual act is an act of squalor. It's the act that anchors us into our incarnate existence, the existence of woe. And she represents the male notion. The Greeks called it soma sema. Life is a tomb, and it's not a womb, it's a tomb. And so this is the turnabout of our existence. Humans used to live joyously, and horror comics speak to this idea that we cannot enjoy our lives because our lives are based in sin, and ultimately there's a comeuppance for any level of enjoyment of our lives. And so the image of maximal enjoyment, and there she is in all her beauty, is now become a predator.
Okay, let's talk about the story, because I read the story, and all of this goes, and this is why the story is so bad, because all of that what you said, Greg, matters none to the story. You're just speculating on one image. This is why
I was responding to the caption.
Very weak Gerber story, because
I was actually responding to
yes, but all of this goes out of the window once Gerber fuses her with a hippie girl who's pregnant, and he brings the strong heroine down to the city level and says, well, let's focus on this hippie girl instead. Why focus on a strong woman? Let's talk about a dependent woman who's with the wrong man. And this is what makes the story sink to a new low. Actually, read the story for a change.
Oh, well, read the story for a change. Well, I'm responding to his captions. He's setting up this notion of society as squalor, and here's this again avenging image.
Yeah,
so for you to talk about, if I may finish, if you go back to this notion, responding to what you're saying about this hippie girl being pregnant, there it is. There is the basis or the conduit upon which humanity is brought into this place of squalor. It's turning the whole notion of joy and living on its head, and that's the basis of these fear comics. Horror comics are all about mortal fear, as opposed to enjoying or engaging in a harmonious life. You're either predated upon or you're meeting your own fears of your mortality in various forms. And that's psychologically apt, because we're told that our life is squalor. We're told that living on this planet is squalor.
Okay.
As Nietzsche would have pointed out.
Okay, if you want to read an analysis of the story, you can go. If you want to read an analysis of the story, who's actually read the story, you can always go to Comic Crusaders, find out.
I think.
Okay, and this is Gerber at his prime, because this is one of the best series Gerber ever did.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Dave?
No,
that's a beautiful Vallejo cover.
You're talking at odds to each other, because Greg's talking about horror comics in general, while you're trying to make a point about the story of the artwork.
Right.
So,
I'm talking about the subliminal elements.
Greg,
Godzilla. Does Godzilla represent Japan's fear of lizards? Does Godzilla represent Japan's loss of deity? No. Godzilla represents, and I'm just talking about that representationally. That individual story, your point's well taken, Chris. I wasn't challenging it.
No, but all I'm just trying to say is, you were taking the conversation away from where it was going. It's kind of, a bit of a rabbit hole.
Our very famous rabbit holes.
Yeah, and we get into enough rabbit holes as it is. So,
well, I'm always interested in what is the basis for these cultural artifacts. Tales of the Zombie. I mean, that's deep stuff, gentlemen.
Oh, I mean, this is stuff out of the Caribbean, if you even think about it. Haiti and all that, and zombie. I mean, what are we talking about here? There's spiritual, there's realism. There's a lot of things here, but at the end of the day,
Originally from
let's
Africa.
talk about let's talk about them comics though. But again, us Puerto Ricans, so it's true though, because Espiritismo comes from it has African, you know, yeah, bro. Horror all across.
Yeah, but what makes Tales? Okay, what makes Tales of the Zombie so interesting? Because if you want to deep dive into this series, which I actually read and wrote about, you can always go on comiccrusaders.shop and find out what it is about. I give you a nutshell. This is the only Marvel comic I know where the character has a complete arc. He starts as this major douchebag who his daughter despises, who becomes a zombie. He finds humanity as a zombie, turns into a good guy, and then he dies for real.
Well, if you're gonna, I'm sorry, Chris. I'll stop talking after this. But I'm gonna jump.
So good.
Even at the bottom, extra bonus, the thing from the bog. Once again, the fetid miasma of the chemistry of life turning into some kind of malign force. And I'm just gonna juxtapose that with this. You have that image again and again. Here you have Alan Moore saying, wait a minute, what if the bog creature is not actually representative of our mortal terms, but it's a regenerative force? It's the god of the bog coming back and saying, actually, that soup is not a place of fear and depredation. It's actually a place of regenesis. And that's what I was kind of getting to. Like Lilith, Lilith is like, you human beings want to eat the garden. You don't want to live and enjoy life. And of course, in a patriarchal society, as so-called, we're not living in a place where we have reverence or honor for the planet we're living on. We're living in a situation where we've got so much smoke in the cave, the planet is starting to melt down. That's the existential horror. Maybe not exactly the terror, which is the portrayal of it, but that's the existential horror, as Stephen King talks about in Dance Macabre, behind all of this mortal fear, all of this horror, all these so-called horror comics. Most horror comics.
All I know is that you guys are making me want to throw my wallet at a comic shop right now. I'm about to go to hipcomic.com and start ordering shit. God damn it, bro.
Is this Bernie Wrightson, Chris?
It is.
Oh, beautiful.
That's Bernie Wrightson. That's Bruce Jones. And can you name the story?
Is it from the Freak Show collection?
Can you name the story?
I don't know. What a day hanging out with ICC?
The rabbit hole?
No, it's one of the most. No, it's one of the most.
I've read.
It's one of the most famous. It's one of the most famous and most copied story in horror comic book magazine history. It's Jennifer, and that one story made Bruce Jones' career.
Wow. This is compositionally masterful.
Jennifer.
Panel, not just for the page, panel to panel. This is compositionally masterful.
Gorgeous.
And this gets us to Bruce Jones' own revival of horror comics in the 80s. This is a Corbin cover.
I was about to say, it looks like Corbin.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Corbin just murders it.
It's Corbin.
Shit, yo. How fun is that cover? How fun? Maybe not for the lady, but for me.
Well, that's exactly my point. I'm sorry. I'm going to go back to it. Here is a figure of the goddess, the white goddess, if you want to call it, the goddess of protean, the life-giving goddess, and she's being torn apart by these mortality-obsessed zombie figures who can't appreciate her as the regenerative. She's just something for them to consume. And again, that's what I'm talking about with this mortal fear. We're so stuck in this notion that the planet is for us to consume to survive, and we're actually destroying the mechanism of our survival, or I should say our renewal. And that's exactly what you have there. We think of, we're trapped, being born in these bodies, and it's her fault. But in fact, it's a regenerative possibility. The eternal return is not about us being trapped in these bodies. It's actually about us having the mechanism in harmony with nature of being able to renew ourselves through regeneration, not immortality, but through continual mortality.
Yeah, and let me be the asshole for a minute, because on this cover, apparently the room is very cold.
I was going to say is I don't think that like half of these great. In fact, I would even say less than 10% of them would think anywhere along your lines, Greg. They just
well, no, I'm not saying that these people have intellectually sat down and said, no, thank you, Dave.
Yeah.
I am not making the argument that these people have said, let's create a story. This is a subconscious, in that respect, almost Freudian response to the terms of the culture we've created. And by the way, speaking of Corbin.
Oh, we got
over to the, there
right?
you go.
There you go. Oh, oof. Oof.
And I'm sorry, I did have photographs. They just didn't come off the. They're still up in the sky somewhere.
I mean, look at homie's beard, bro. I mean, this is back in the day, son. The hair, the panels, the coloring, the emotion. Holy fuck, bro.
Yes, Corbin's wonderful. I love his airbrushed artwork, but man, his pen and ink work, something else.
Whoa, that is a fucking maze ball, bro.
But if we can we go back, because there's something else to talk about this issue. Because if you just go by the cover, it's there to lure readers in, and what they are confronted with is the first story, which is by Corbin actually, which tells a completely different story, because it tells the story of a man who hooks up with a woman, and he's Can I please finish my thought? Thank you very much.
Sorry.
He hooks up with this woman. He hooks up with this woman who bloody murders him. And this is very indicative of Bruce Jones' own relationship at that time, married to a strong woman who will eventually leave him. And this is very much completely the opposite of what we see here on the cover.
You're making I would argue, you're making my point of this. It's not them sitting down and going, this analytical, oh, ho, ho. Exactly, that's the point. These are very subconscious and very visceral responses to a culture that does not live in harmony with nature. Exactly. So if you look directly between her legs and go straight down, I mean, there you have a leering,
I see it,
figure. And he's not just looking up her skirt. He's planning to feed upon her. Now, do you guys get the concept of apocalypse, which is to rip the veil away from what's been hidden? To rip the veil away from what's been hidden. And they are tearing the veil of her dress away from her so they can reveal what's hidden. They think they're going to eat her blood and eat her body and be somehow sustained. What actually is going on, and again, going back to these archetypal forms, what you actually have is this sense of mortal fear, turn dust to dust and our bodies don't last, misunderstanding the iconography of the goddess as a rejuvenative force and just wanting to feed on it. And that is a trope throughout horror comics. It's a trope throughout international poetry, but it's also in science fiction. We have so many stories of us trying to escape a planet that isn't going to betray us with mortality and finding a paradise. We've been living in paradise from the time we came into the savannah, but instead of living in harmony with it, we've been slowly and systematically doing exactly what's portrayed on this cover, which is we have been predating upon the means of our renewal. Nature is the means of our renewal.
So also, horror cells, sex cells, put them both together. There we go.
Yeah, and I just want to say this, for you lady to say that men don't go down on you. Look, zombies are willing to go down on you. All right, they'll eat you out. I mean, they may not eat you out the way you want, but they'll eat you up. I'm just saying, you see.
Larry Flint of all people made a very interesting point in this regard. He said, you guys object to me and I mean, I'm not making an offer for Hustler, but he said, you object to me disrobing the female and showing the object of your desire, and yet you see that as pornography, whereas you will show scenes of the battlefield, and this is Larry Flint in his day in the era of Vietnam. You will show people on the battlefield who have been destroyed for what purpose, and you don't see the pornography in that. So yes, sex sales, horror sales, if in a different scenario, we might be able to look at this. This is a perfect example of this, and we could look at that with reverence. We could look with that with the glory of our own desire for her, instead of needing to feed upon her. That's the subliminal message of most of this. As if you've read Stephen King's Dance Macabre, which I'm sure you have, Chris.
Yeah, Chris has some audio delays, which is kind of causing this issue where we speak over each other, which is not normal, folks, as you know.
Yeah, sorry about that.
You know, that's just things that happen with the technology.
And I'm excited to be here because I missed the last one. Sorry, guys. I apologize.
So this is all I want to ask of us right now. When somebody says their comment, let's count in our heads to 10 and then reply. Okay, for the very least, at the very least. So let me just say that I love this page. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 panels full of verbiage, but a lot of story being told even without its words. I mean, just in the posing of the characters, the actions, the visuals, the faces. You see that this is a man trying to get hooked up, enjoying his life, and he about to get some shit turned upside down.
If I may say, the first panel encapsulates it. I mean, here you have a man who's in severe armor, which removes him from his natural state, and he's literally attacking the dragon, which is, of course, the cyclical return. And behind that form is the actual thing, the thing that receives both his desire and his contempt, which is the woman who represents the natural cycle, which is represented by the serpent, which is the eternal return. I mean, it's you don't have to sit down and go, oh yeah, I'm gonna do this consciously for those archetypal images to continuously play out. I think it's lovely that this is from the 70s, because this is when we were first having our first real sense of environmental crisis. We had an ongoing war where people were being continually ground up. Korea, Vietnam, going on. And what's not happening is making an effort to
I just want to say something here, though. Doesn't that look like Dr. Phil? I mean, I always gotta throw in the dumb shit. I'm just saying. But this is great. And of course, here we have the most important thing that we got to talk about. Because here goes Chris with this amazing book, The Neon Graveyard, currently available on Amazon, that is definitely inspired by so many of these old school stories, not just comics, but film and all. What Chris has done here is create a masterpiece. And this is one of 3, folks. So you guys got to check it out. Let me just put this on screen. You guys got to go to Amazon because it's on there right now. So what I want to do, folks, because with this picture, we were about to get into Dave's, right? But Dave has now DM'd me a wonderful idea for the next ICC. Okay? So what we're going to do is save his pictures for the next ICC, right? But when it comes to horror, and this is a sample of what we're going to start with right there, folks. You see that? That's gorgeous. Won't tease you no more than that. Because what I need you to do is go buy this book right now. All right? Well, I need you guys to do is that. I won't
judge your book by a cover, but you don't have to read the book to see the subliminal message in that image.
Well, I'll say that I'm actually in the midst of reading this book, and it is one hell of a page turner already. The prologue hooked me in right away, and the subsequent first couple of chapters have been fantastic. Well worth it, folks. If you're a fan of just mystery and horror fiction, you'll be really big into this. It's got some tremendous elements and some very fascinating characters at the same time.
It does. Chris is very talented. I've been blessed to have him on my team, have him on ICC. And listen, folks, you got to support this man. He has one of the best Twitters out in the world. Buse_Chris, please. Like, if you guys want to learn some shit in comic history, that's a fantastic conversational Twitter if I've ever seen one. Period. There ain't no one topping Chris right now. And when you see Dave jump in, holy fuck! And now Dr. G is on Twitter. Watch out, folks! Holy shit! And of course, Bracy. I mean, he even engaged in a whole conversation with Eric J. Larson this week over the sexuality of Ant, the character. Very great conversation that is going to hopefully lead into an interview. I see Dave biting his lip. What's going on, Dave?
No, no. All I was going to say is, I'm glad Jeff's here, and maybe we can get Jeff back again, because it was when we were talking last time, and we've talked about it a lot before, but you brought it up as well about how every generation, every wave of artists is always on somebody else's shoulders. Everyone's constantly building on each other. So the images I'd picked were really just to hammer that home. But as you were all talking, I realized that could be a whole thing of its own. And as we're getting up to 2 hours, I thought let's make it its own thing. It's not about horror. It's just about how everyone builds on each other, and there's so many amazing talents that we've all talked about. We talked about today. Why is this person not held in more wide regard? Why do we not? Why is this creator's name not on our tongue? And it's because somebody else came along and stood on their shoulders and built on what they had, and we like them now instead of the original artist. And
isn't that crazy though? Yeah. I hate us as humans sometimes when we do that. Oh, that's the next big thing. F the last person. No, appreciate the last person, because if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have what we have now. For me, it's always about appreciation. So I'm glad to have you, Dave, on the team. You are a creator that's been killing it, as is Dr. G. So you guys yourselves are giants that people are following on, in all types of circles. So thank you guys for doing what you do. A big cheers to you guys. And Chris is now among those giants, because there's going to be people that want to be the next great novelist like Chris Buse. You know what I mean? And of course,
it's an excellent point, Dave, because it's the nature of these stories to want to be regenerated, and everyone's looking for a fresh presentation. We can pick apart almost any artist and see their influences, and yet they're doing as Chris is doing something very fresh with what are, and that to me is the challenge of genre fiction, is to take these tropes and refresh them in a way that you have something original and different to say, which Chris clearly does. But yeah, the current generation isn't going to look back to Kirby and go, "Ooh, I got to read that." They're going to go, "How has it progressed, and how does it speak to me currently?"
Isn't that the truth? As all books. I mean, I just read a wonderful book called Cloaked by Mike Richardson, the creator of The Mask and the producer of the Hellboy films. Let me tell you, he kind of spun the whole super heroic vigilante genre on its head, flipped it. Especially for people from the street. So like for me, this is a New York book. It's like, what if somebody showed up and just did things to kind of, step up to be something bigger on their own, even though not nice. You feel me? So it's like, I love it. I love that the creators are building upon things and using history and saying, look, well, imagine an old school hero that did this then, where would they be now? And what would they do? So it's like, it's really a mind fuck. And that's what I love about comics and talking to people like you here. We're so facing on the past, right? Talking about that past, because without them, we wouldn't have what we have now. So we gotta, folks that are listening, appreciate these pioneers from EC, Warren, fucking, Charlton, everything that Chris mentioned, Marvel, DC, horror. I mean, without these folks, we wouldn't have what we have. So show them the love. I mean, and don't try to cancel no one, because again, always think about the time, please. And not that it was appropriate, but that was what it is at the time. And if we try to erase the past, we will never create a better future.
Well, T.S. Eliot says we spend the majority of our time chasing away from what we know, what we were brought up with, to find ultimately that we return home. And of course, the journey, Chris is a novelist and he's completely immersed in narrative storytelling. That is the hero's journey, is to find something within your existence, or to be called away from your existence, so that you can value your existence in another, in a refreshed. Because it's all about, that's what the eternal return is about. It's not about finding vampires. To get back to the subject, vampires are the ultimate expression of a malign immortality. They predate upon living beings. They are undead. They have no life left of their own. And that's the quest for immortality. It's the ultimate expression of a malign immortality. But the nature of our planet, the nature of creation itself, is about the regeneration, the recombination, the renewal. So when a man and woman come together in a loving way and not a fearful way, and reproduce a third party, which is going back to the Kabbalah. You have the one that becomes the two that creates all of the fluorescence. When it's natural and it's accepted, the man and the woman are both regenerated in that child. And we've turned this on our head because humanity has this, and there's many reasons for this. Nietzsche would attribute it to Christianity per se, but we have this idea that there is something at fault or broken or an original sin within creation because we're not immortal. And that's the egoic frame, Freud would say, that's the egoic frame that quests for its own self-preservation in the most literal way. Whereas I would say Chris's novel, it regenerates the form and it regenerates the tropes in his own fresh way. And thank God. And when Chris moves on to his 20th novel and then another Stephen King comes along, they'll do the same thing. And that's not the detriment of what went before. It's the refreshment of what went before.
Yes.
And many of these horror images we're looking at is the fear. Something is going to grab me. My old age is going to grab me. This is a Johnny Craig tribute. This guy, my future self is going to come back to the life that I have now. And it's going to say, why didn't you do better? Or give me the life that you should have had. And that's the end of us. And it causes immense and amazing fear. And one of the ways that we deal with that is we sexualize it because that's the means of our reproduction. But we're ambivalent about it because my child is not me reborn, it's me rejuvenated. And instead of honoring the life of that child and going, I'm going to give you everything I got, we're like, largely in our society, our children, we don't see them for the regeneration that we are. We see them for another round of misery. And that we're caught in that loop. We're caught in that loop. And the answer to that loop isn't, to tear down the walls. It's to reframe how we're living within those walls.
Preach, man. The world needs stuff like this where we could kind of look upon ourselves and hopefully stop all the stuff that's going on and just live and enjoy good conversation, live our lives, and just enjoy our fandoms and fucking die of old age. And that's that. That's what I want.
Well, the planet's melting anyway, so why don't we just foment World War III and get it over with?
No, man, I don't want it. I need some more time, brother. I need more time. Once Comic Crusaders is #1, then let it be end of the world. Right.
I'm a mystic, Al. What I would say to you is what's going on right now is we're getting an ultimate iteration of the mindset that says I must own and control. And if I can't own it and control it, I'll burn it down and rebuild it. Well, and that's not regeneration. That's the zombie mentality of I'll create the shells of these buildings and then I'll just reflock them.
It's also in it when people talk about where's your humanity? To me, that is humanity.
Yeah.
We have the capability for so much more.
Yes.
But whenever we get to that, whenever anybody gets to a point where they have power, wealth, or anything else, 99.999 times out of 100, it's screw everybody else. I don't care if everybody else dies. I don't care if the world ends after I pass. I don't care because it's all about me right now.
Yeah. I've got mine. But Chris, Dave, classical culture was built on the continuity. We're going to take it this far, you will build upon that. We're going to take it this far, you will build upon that. And the Roman Empire, so to speak, I'm not talking about its depredations, that lasted 2,000 years all told between Rome and Byzantium. That was a continuity where they were continually building upon what went before, as opposed to, of course, eventually the notion of destroying to preserve and destroying to own instead of building on one's own.
Well, they were destroying all the whole time. They destroyed as they went along. And it's like anyone else. Like what they did is, I think it's also a misconception as well to talk about the Romans as though they gave us the roads and everything else, because that's what the Romans stole from Africa.
Well, it's what they imposed as well. That wasn't something they gave us as a gift.
But the technology, the roads, the aqueducts, most of that actually came from Africa and was taken from there by the Romans. And then they went, oh, this is good. And then they started everyone should have this everywhere we go, and installed that.
And in the name of the ideology of a unified humanity, they became authoritarian impositions.
But you're thinking in terms of the Romans thinking about a unified humanity when they just didn't give a shit.
Well,
Again,
what do you mean didn't give a shit?
No,
they gave a shit about creating. I mean, they basically continued the dream of Alexander, which was the problem with humanity is we're not all living under one system, not in harmony, but under one system.
If you look at what's happening in the world now, you have each country, each civilization thinking of itself as a whole, but it's all the components of it, the individual people, are all corrupt, flawed. So we can never achieve any of it, and Rome was no different.
That's exactly my point about living in harmony as opposed to contest.
But that is, the harmony that we've always seemed to find is this negative one. It's there's no harmony as in we're all feeling great. It's the harmony of we're just, everyone's just cannon fodder. Everyone is
symptomatic of the Kali Yuga. We're not living in an age that's predicated on civilizational harmony. We're living in an age that's predicated on civilizational contests.
Has there ever? I mean, there's not much evidence that there has ever been many of those.
There's some evidence, and
I would have said that some of the civilizations that were destroyed, because, as I said, it's like when the Romans went into Africa, there's very few civilizations that were all about spreading harmony and a justifiable equality.
We continue to live this way.
You could actually make the argument that Genghis Khan thought he was spreading harmony. I take your point.
Genghis Khan?
That was what was it? Something like, I'm trying to think about how many millions he killed.
Absolutely.
40
That's
million
again
people, something like that.
Yeah, the harmony of death. That's why he had this smooth rhythm. He was
again. It's the misconception of imposing one ideological rule.
Crazy. But you know what? We're going to talk about rulers, and the only rulers that I care about on ICC are the rulers of comics. So check out with us in 2 weeks. We talk about people that have risen on the shoulders of giants. All right. And that's a great idea by Dave. I can't wait. So I'm going to leave those pictures off for that. And again, today, apologies, people, for real, on that little slight delay, between the U.S. and Germany, if you will, apparently. I don't know if that's the Russians' involvement in trying to slow Chris's word down and shit, but F them over there. Ukraine stay strong. People stay strong. America stay strong. UK stay strong. Wepa, let's do it up. This is the International Comic Crusaders. We're here showing love to the whole world of comics, the whole universe of comics, the galaxy of comics. I'm Al Mega with Dr. Greg G, which is now on Twitter, folks. All right. Chris Buse, Dave Elliott, and the one and only Jeff Bracey, which you could, of course, find on Cinema Crusaders and Sloppy Spoilers as well. Thank you for hanging out, brother. Thank you, people, for tuning in. Everyone rocks. Much love. And hasta la próxima. Wepa, my Mega Comic Crusaders International CC, and we out. Later.